Hello and welcome to Mandibil, or The Perfect Principle, depending on how you want to see it. Long time no see. I've been busy. I've been sort of maybe taking a little break from my usual musings here on my channel. But I'm, in recent days, not that I'm going to, give you 5 videos a week or anything like that in the coming period, anything like that. But I want to say that I've just sort of grabbed the news that Mr. Bernardo Kastrup has been received a virtual hailstorm of criticism and pushback in the recent times, in the recent weeks, right? And I might remind you that he does what he can to push back, you could say, right? But I don't find his pushbacks convincing. They feel like your average mudslinging trench warfare, right? It's like, I can't believe you misunderstand my words and think, and you're attacking me personally. Not exactly, maybe, but it has that air of it, in my opinion, right? What a truly good philosopher should be able to is take criticism and disregard your own opinion, your own psychology, your own needs and wants to actually try it on for size, or however you want to put it, to figure out whether there's actually something to it. Maybe there is some problem with your philosophy, right? And that's one of the reasons why I constantly tell my listeners, and thank you for staying listeners. I don't think I have missed or anybody of my regular subs have dropped me during the last 5 or 6 months or so, right, during the summer period here. So thank you for staying on board. But, I keep telling you, it's your philosophy. My philosophy is my philosophy. It's not our philosophy. I hope you're not, I hope you're subbing to my channel because you want some inspiration. But you don't want somebody to tell you what to think. That in itself is appeal to it's a begging the question kind of approach, right? I want my experiences to tell me how to classify and qualify and quantify and so on, philosophize about my experiences. Well, you can't do that because you need those experiences in order to, and so on, right? I've stated this before, and you get my point, right? Well, with that out of the way, right? One of the things that whenever I sort of venture into his website, for whatever reason, I usually try to stay clear. But what tends to puzzle me is this coat of arms. Who would want shit like this? And I've commented on it before, right? Who would want this? Unless you're some kind of mystic, or you're a part of the Illuminati, or, right? You are in 33 degrees of Freemasonry or whatever. These are the kind of people who want shit like this, right? And okay, the dude, he was plucked from Latino world to go to Switzerland to his Hadron Collider. The Hadron Collider is the cathedral of Illuminati, supposedly, right? It's not far out, right? And then the subtitle, of course you need to know he has 2 PhDs, because that's very important. That's the best argument, right? Meditations on life, the universe, and everything. Well, why do you need to see life and universe if you are going to say everything anyway? Right? It's the life, universe, and everything. Well, is everything but universe and life? And is life not a part of universe? And is everything beyond the universe? Well, it's just bullshit, right? This is bullshit. Okay. Just, your random reaction to this dude, right? Okay. Rupert Sheldrake, which supposedly was one that was in the warmth of his congregation and his inner circle of academic connections and celebrities and whatever he wants to lean up against and hope that they can sort of, oh, you can get to become a part of the Essentia Foundation, and then you're sort of, oh, you know, you're wrapped in this whatever, right? And Theories of Everything by Kurt Jamunkel made a video with Sheldrake, Rupert Sheldrake, where they discuss idealism, and at some point, Rupert Sheldrake, sorry about that, he mentions Bernardo Kastrup. And of course, Bernardo reacts to that, right? And that's the whole article here that responds to Rupert Sheldrake's criticisms of analytic idealism. Okay, let's hear Rupert here, right?
That's why you go round in circles, and it's called the hard problem. So what we've seen recently is a revival of idealism, particularly in the work of Bernardo Kastrup, who tries to flip the physicalism on its side, invert it, and say, well, the ultimate reality is consciousness. Matter is, in fact, sort of done mind. And what makes his proposition attractive to a lot of scientists is he says that basically, for the rest of science, it's business as usual. We just changed the envelope within which we understand everything, flipped it around. But it's still reductionist, it's still naturalist, it's still there's nothing outside nature, it's still a kind of physicalism, except now it's idealist physicalism. And he actually, one of his great selling points is it leaves science undisturbed. Reductionism carries on as before. You know, in basic workings of science carry on just as they were before, except you change the framework within which you see it.
Well, this sort of a somewhat deeper one, right? And the depth is that I'm not sure that these people, and not least this guy, Rupert Sheldrake, actually understands what you're doing when you're doing science. And I'm not quite sure that Bernardo Kastrup understands it either. Or at least it's somewhat confused. And, you know, so two more or less confused people attacking each other for not doing it correctly or having their own version of it is not necessarily the best starting point for taking up this discussion about what entails mind and matter and science and so on, metaphysics and so on. I would always say that you have to go back and do it yourself. You have to create your own ontology. You have to create, if you want a metaphysics, you have to establish that external world. And first, and I'm not saying you can't establish a external world and not do metaphysics. That's actually my approach, because I'm not establishing, I'm not proving it, but I am deciding to go with it. But if you want to do a metaphysics, which is, in my opinion, where you attempt to go and do ontology about an external world, then you have to qualify how you can get to do that. Because you have to establish that world you're then discussing, right? You cannot just say, I'm deciding to go there, and now I can go and tell you about it. No, right? That would be saying that the Middle Earth is just around the corner over there, beyond those hills. Yeah, and now I can go and tell you about Middle Earth, right? No, that doesn't work, right? I have to actually qualify. If you can't even get to Middle Earth over there by the hills, beyond the hills, how do I justify that it's there? Well, that's the big problem that nobody, in my opinion, seemed to actually pinpoint. And that's why there's confusion, I think, about whether or not Bernardo Kastrup is actually idealism in the purest sense, or whether it's some kind of crony materialism, right? And that's one, and you can dig into this yourself, because this video is going to be basically about somebody else recently criticizing Bernardo Kastrup. I just wanted to bring this up in order to, along all the lines that I've been criticizing Bernardo for at least a year, or maybe going on 2 years, right? And a lot of the things that I pointed out is actually what these people are starting to point out. So I do wonder if some of them had actually picked a bit of my criticisms, and all I want is a bit of giving the courtesy of being the one who brought it up first, right? Or if you're inspired from me, please let me know that I'm your inspiration. That's all that's all I crave, right? I want to go back down to this one because I think it's central to this problem. And all the other things they're discussing is sort of a fallout from this, or dependent on this. Analytic idealism is just a form of physicalism. Yeah, again, it's a matter of definitions, right? And one of the problems of Bernardo Kastrup's approach to everything is he just cherry picks a reduction base, right? Which he calls mind. And then he just establishes whatever he wants to be there without actually giving any good arguments, in my opinion, or very few at least, right? And they're sort of gray area kind of arguments usually. Sort of halfway taking things for granted, but throwing a few terms up in the air that sounds like there is some kind of argument there, but it's hard to find, right? I like philosophical arguments to be extremely clear, so I am confident that nobody is trying to screw with me, or at least the one presenting it, right? So prior today it says, I could never have imagined that such, oh my God, sis, oh my God, I'm fainting, right? That such a superficial misunderstanding could come from a nuanced and careful thinker and communicator, as I have known Rupert to be, right? It is an in-your-face misrepresentation. Oh, he's going for you personally, right? Because he's personally invested in his philosophy. In my opinion, my conclusion is, he needs this particular philosophy. He has an agenda about what he wants. And then he wraps his philosophy around it. It's an agenda-driven philosophy. He's not interested in finding things he don't want there, right? So he ends up in a position where he gets the philosophy he wants. It's sort of a confirmation bias, maybe you could say. But I would rather say it's a narrative where you're wrapping a story around that narrative, and only way down the line, after a lot of weird philosophy, it's like, I get my mind daddy, or whatever it is he's going for, right? And therefore he's so personally and emotionally invested in it, because it's what gives him some kind of mental peace or something like that, right? So he wants this philosophy to be the case. That's why he's so hung up on trying to convince the world that he's right about it, right? A vulgar straw man conveyed in a confusingly enthusiastic, authoritative and definitive tone. I'd have expected him to, at the very least, have preambled his unfortunate mischaracterization with words like, as far as I understand it, or insofar as I know from briefly looking at it, or something to that effect. That would have been a bare minimum for the sake of transparency, caution, and honesty, but he presented himself in both tone and demeanor as an expert thoroughly acquainted with the thing he was liberally mischaracterizing. Okay, that's one of the reasons why I prefer to do sentence by sentence deconstructions. Right? Because somebody like Bernardo Kastrup, he will jump on me and say, you're mischaracterizing and you're trying to attack me, and I would expect you to do it like this and do it like that, and therefore it's no good what you're doing, right? So if I'm referring to a particular sentence he uses, right, or a lack of a sentence I would expect to be there, I would say, okay, this is missing, that is missing, this is not good enough, that is not good enough, or this is good maybe, right? But in where Sheldrake is kind of encompassing his general notion about what Bernardo Kastrup is trying to do, he's going to be attacked for, doing straw man instead, or fallacies, right? And we're not going to get anywhere. Bernardo continues. The only metaphysical equivalence between analytic idealism... Okay, there's something else before I go on with this. I was thinking that Bernardo Kastrup here lectures Sheldrake on how he should do this, right? So you should do it like this, that, and the other. Otherwise, I'm not going to listen to you, right? Okay, but isn't that what I've been doing for at least a year, right? And I've been doing very, very sentence by sentence deconstructions of his shit. Has he reacted to that? No, because I don't have too many listeners. So I'm not that dangerous, right? But if I had 600,000 listeners rather than 400, right? Or 600, how many it is? I think it's, how many is it? 400 or 600, I don't know. Somewhere there, right? About 500. He would be more concerned, right? Because I would have a bigger audience. And that would be more, quote, dangerous to him, right? So he only cares whether or not somebody can actually attack him in the broader spectrum of trying to convince the big grey audience about what he's doing. And somebody like me who doesn't have a big platform, he doesn't care whether or not I'm actually presenting some good arguments, right? But because Theory of Everything by Kurt Jaimunkel and Sheldrake has a much bigger platform, a much bigger amount of ears listening, he's more dangerous to it. So this is this has this sort of a political cultish flavor to it, right? It's not for the sake of good philosophy. It's for the sake of how can I convince a lot of people. Okay, back to the sentence. The only metaphysical equivalence between analytic idealism and mainstream physicalism is that both acknowledge the existence of an external world. Well, acknowledge is not an argument. I mean, if it's so important that people give you good arguments or counter arguments or counter deconstruction or whatever you want to call it, why don't you present a fucking argument for that external world? Acknowledge is not an argument. Acknowledge, what is it? I acknowledge this. If you can just say acknowledge and think you have done philosophy, I mean, sorry to bring it to you, babe, mate, not babe, far from it, right? Mate, and acknowledge an existence of the world beyond our individual minds. But that's neither here nor there. What if physicalism is incorrect in acknowledging the existence of an external world? Then you actually have to argue. You can't just lean up against physicalism and say we're doing the same as physicalism. And maybe that's the reason why Sheldrake is sort of confused about it. Because you have that external world. You're doing the science. You're making observations and relying on reporting from women in Germany saying they are 3 different persons at the same time and so on, right? I mean, what's the actual difference between somebody calling it matter or somebody calling it mind out there? If you're going to do the same thing anyway, what the fuck is the difference between physicalism and idealism, right? There isn't any other than the use of the terms. And you can't create a philosophy from throwing terms at it until you think you have convinced somebody, right? First of all, you need to, I wouldn't say you need to convince yourself, but you need to be on top of your own philosophy without actually putting words to it in sort of this kind of textual manner. And when you've done the philosophy, then you can present it using terms. But then you have to be strict about how you get to those terms, right? If you have a starting point, you say, I'm cherry-picking mind. Well, where did the term mind come from? Where? Is it a proto-ontology of some kind that you're not you're alluding to, but you're not presenting? How do you get to it, right? So it's it's the starting point that is dysfunctional in his philosophy, and the missing argument for an external world. Just because materialists are working from the idea of an external world doesn't mean that you can do it, right? And if you just do it in the same kind of naive approach that materialists seem to be doing it, well, there's no difference actually between you and a materialist, right? You just want to call that outside world made of the same thing as what is inside to avoid dualism and get rid of the hard problem, right? Okay, you can dig into this, and sorry about the dinging there. You can dig into this yourself. What I'm actually trying to go for is this one. A guy I don't know how I bumped into it, but I bumped into him, I think, on Facebook. But that might be my recollection that isn't actually completely correct. But this guy spends almost an hour refuting Bernardo Kastrup's analytic idealism. Basically, he says it doesn't work, and he's basically completely on the same page as I am in my criticism, and the criticism as I have presented it during the last year or so, right? At least a year. But this is more dense than your average YouTube philosophy session. This guy obviously has read a lot of classic philosophy like Immanuel Kant, David Hume, and I'm very happy that he mentions and quotes David Hume, because in my opinion, Hume is a very underrated, though many people like him. When it comes to sort of idealism and things like that, no idealist seems to be interested in Hume, and he is right up there, right, with Kant. Kant even stated that he was dogmatic before he actually read Hume, right? And I would be surprised if it wasn't the idea of the external world and all that was what he retracted into an internal world, quote, a starting point approach, Immanuel Kant, that actually put himself in the center and the Copernican thing there, right? Okay, enough of that. But I want to say that this guy, Felipe Bautista, is quite dense in his use of terms. It's not ununderstandable, but it's clearly somebody who using official academic terms about philosophy, and some of it might go over my head. If there's some quote to some Latin or something like that, it might completely go over my head, right? So bear with me, right? I try to understand this as well as I can, and I would like to extend the idea that if you want to be understood, appeal to the broader audience rather than sticking to extending a sort of a coded academic language that shows that you're on top of your shit, but it might fly over the head of most people. If you want people to understand, the lay person, the average person like me, what you're doing, then you might want to downgrade the licks level of your criticism so that it's more understandable. I understand that there might be some difficulties using that kind of average, peasant language, but it inherently contradicts itself that you want to criticize, but you are potentially creating a very hard to understand criticism that very few people might actually understand. So your criticism might not come across. And the guy you want to criticize might be sort of satisfied that the appeal is not that great. So, just my thought. But, okay, let's dive in. We have sort of, let's say, about 30-35 minutes until the 1 hour mark. And this might turn into a several part series. So let's kick in. I wonder what that music is. It sounds romantic. It sounds like Schubert or something like that, right? I'm not sure. I'm not. I think I've heard it before, but I'm not sure where it's from, right? It could be the Forellen Quintet by Schubert or something like. It sounds romantic. Also the mountains and all that. It's sort of early to mid 1800s, right?
Why Kastrup's Analytic Idealism Fails, written by Felipe Bautista. To attempt to extract from a purely arbitrary idea the existence of an object corresponding to it is a quite unnatural procedure and a mere innovation of scholastic subtlety. Immanuel Kant.
Okay, so he starts off by quoting. And when you start off by quoting, you're actually diminishing your own, in my opinion, this is my take on it, why I don't like to quote. It's certainly not if I was to write a book about, this is a criticism, so maybe it's not that important, right? But quoting is basically saying, this guy said it better than I could ever say it, right? So, and it's also leaning up against authority, so it's sort of an appeal to authority. It's just a thought, right? So let's leave it at that. But what Immanuel Kant, I suppose, is trying to say is, okay, if I have an experience, and it's the same thing that Hume was talking about, right? In some passages in his text, that if I have experience of X, and I say, and because I have experience of X, there's something before X that is responsible for X. Let me argue. How do you do that? Right? I mean, the X, if I'm experiencing a color, I can't get to why I'm experiencing that color, or that sound, or that taste. How would I do that? Yeah, I could say that, yeah, but the color is actually a lawn outside my window. I could go and taste that lawn. Yeah, but that would not explain why it's green, right? You could get closer and closer and closer, so to say, to that green. You will never get beyond green, right? So, it's another way of saying that what Kant is pointing out, he's maybe a little skeptical about it. He's sort of, okay, it sounds like a crazy kind of argumentation structure. And to me it is, because you can't. I mean, how could you possibly? You can't argue for it, right? You can't say, yeah, but it's there because of whatever. All that because of entails a lot of things being taken for granted or being dogmatic about it. And physicalist kind of dogmatic, and that refers back to the criticism I talked about earlier in the Sheldrake incident there, right? That if you're talking about something beyond, you have already settled there must be something beyond, but you don't have access to it. Now you're trying to figure out what it is or argue your way towards it or whatever, right? But why do you think there is something? Right? Why? What is it? What's the argument? How do you get there? Why do you think there is an outside of your colors, for instance, right? And I mean, honestly, I have never seen an argument for it. All I've seen are people like Kant and Hume saying, well, you can't get to it. Even if it's there, you can't get to it. So, and by saying even if, it's like even if you could establish that there must be something out there, you couldn't get to whatever is out there, right? But I would say you can't even get to the argument for why you think there is an out there. You cannot create an argument because that argument must be based on that experience you are saying is a result of that external world. So you're always extracting something from that experience and going into your epicycles of thinking and saying there must be something beyond that color or whatever, right? That's what Kant and probably based somewhat on Hume, he says.
The aim of the present writing is to make clear in what sense Kastrupian analytic idealism inevitably is groundless, and inevitably is a case of dogmatic metaphysics. Mr. Bernardo Kastrup's analytic idealism insists on the transcendental reality of an alleged mind at large, and its alleged alters referring to other minds, such that...
Yeah, and it's again this, okay, to put it bluntly, right? If this guy, Bernardo Kastrup, he cannot give me a very, very reasonable argument for why he thinks there is an external world, and how also, even if he can establish that external world, how can you go and tell me about how it's put together? Right? It's sort of a two-step thing. He just pretends there is an external world, and because it's there, he can tell you something about what it is. It's all imaginary. All of it, in my opinion, is imaginary, because you're always working in the confinement of what you are and what you have. You're working from your ontology, or what is described by your ontology. All the phenomena you have, from colors to sounds to elephants and bears, and emotions, feelings, joy, philosophy, science, whatever, all that which are abstractions from the other categories, in my opinion, which are the qualia of color, sounds, taste, touch, and smell, right? And the cognitions based on these qualia, which could be bears and pizzas and bicycles, right? For instance. The rest are just derived from that, established from that, right? But because these abstractions and ideas and imagination has become a story that has also become a creation story that goes before you, that actually attempts to go before you actually had that experience of that bicycle. You think there actually a world before the bicycle, that you are sort of, it's sort of this kind of circular imaginary storytelling or reality idea, right? Okay.
That I and all possible minds are excitations of one absolute mind at large. Incidentally, under no
Yeah, but it's okay, there's an external world. Okay, he calls it mind at large. Okay, so it's manipulative, right? Because by taking the term mind, he's already imbuing that external world of his that he hasn't argued for with mind. It's sophistry, right? He is dragging around terms to impregnate these terms on you. So he is avoiding having to actually argue for it, but he's just sort of a sleight of hand kind of thing. He just brings it in. Oh my God, I said mind, so it must be mind, right?
circumstances can Mr. Kastrup insist on the empirical reality of a mind at large, or other minds. Neither a mind at large nor other minds can be given in a possible experience. Experience affords access only to immanent appearances, and appearances are immanent representations in me.
Yeah, okay, but careful, right? Immanent is what your immanent experience is, what the actual experience is before you even you don't describe it, you don't imagine anything. It's just that bare-bone experience. So that bare-bone first level phenomena, which I would say is the qualia, like color, sound, smell, taste, and touch, right? Those are the immanents I believe he's talking about. But if you want to add a story about that calls these are representations, then you're just adding that story without arguing for it, right? So be careful, you're not doing the same thing that Bernardo Kastrup is doing. Now, I might be misunderstanding what he's trying to do. He's trying to talk of it as if he was Bernardo Kastrup telling you about it, right? So it's this kind of second person approach. He pretends to be Bernardo presenting the argument, but it's not his argument. He's just presenting the argument as if it was Bernardo presenting it, right? So you have to be careful when you listen to this kind of deconstruction, right? Okay.
Such that Mr. Kastrup, insofar as he does insist on the reality of a mind at large and other minds, a mind at large and its alters, implies the transcendental reality of such, or says nothing meaningful at all.
So we go into using the term transcendental, right? It's like, I don't like this transcendental. If somebody came up with transcendental, all of a sudden there is access to an external world. But it doesn't matter what term you use, right? Just because Immanuel Kant or whoever used the term transcendental doesn't mean that there's all of a sudden an access. And it is dangerous. It's these fucking philosophers, right? I have a notion that there are bad philosophers and there are good philosophers. But good philosophers also have a limitation on how far they can go in their skepticism. At some point, they're going to start to say, I'm going to take this shit for granted, right? And it's when they start to take shit for granted, you have to be careful. Because if they take shit for granted, it's important they state how they do it. How they approach the idea of taking shit for granted, right? Because if you're taking shit for granted, the argument actually stops there. Because you're taking it for granted, right? You can't base another argument on that which you took for granted. Because you didn't argue for it. So you're not allowed to go any further in that direction, in my opinion, right? So be careful how they do this.
Now, Kastrupian analytic idealism is inescapably groundless specifically because it is dogmatic metaphysics. Dogmatism entails the presumption that it is possible to make progress with pure knowledge, according to principle.
Pure knowledge. Okay, so I don't know if this is a reference to Immanuel Kant or something like that, but don't use the term knowledge when you're doing metaphysics or ontology. Because, in my opinion, knowledge is a result, is a what falls out from the philosophy called epistemology. And you need to have settled your ontology first. And if you want to do some metaphysics, you might not need to settle that, but I would like it to be settled before you do anything beyond ontology. So if you do first ontology, and I presented my ideas of how you approach these things, right, in my series on my ontology. You want to jump out and do some metaphysics, but then you get back to your ontology, and from that stepstone, you start to do epistemology, and at that point, you can start to use the term knowledge, right? So, be careful. Make sure that, if you're doing metaphysics, no knowledge, in my opinion. And if you're just throwing the term knowledge around in metaphysics or ontology, and you haven't done epistemology that is very clearly laid out before this person starts to talk metaphysics and ontology, they're screwing with you, in my opinion, because they are appealing to something that has nothing to do there.
From concepts alone. Because neither a mind at large nor other minds can be given in a possible experience, eo ipso, reason has access only to the concepts of a mind at large and other minds. And because Kastrupian analytic idealism insists on the transcendental reality of a mind at large and other minds from concepts alone, it would entail blatant absurdity to insist on the empirical reality of a mind at large or other minds because experience allows access only to immanent representations. Eo ipso, Kastrupian analytic idealism inescapably is dogmatism. Kastrupian analytic idealism is a case of pre-critical dogmatic building castles in the air. A case of pre-critical illegitimately infer...
Pre-critical, I think that is, and you may correct me, but that's an appeal to Immanuel Kant and his critique of pure reason and other kinds of critiques that he did, right? And it's basically the idea of that external world and metaphysics of it and how you get to it and all that, right? That if you are pre-critique, you are actually thinking naively about it and thinking that your experience is an actual external world. And that's naive realism, right? And metaphysics, materialism, sort of, right? Materialism is the scientific kind of approach to naive realism, maybe you could say, right? But if it's pre-criticism or pre-critic, it's like, I hear that as a naive realism. Or in another word, in another way of saying it is, he takes an external world for granted, just like the average materialist does, right? He doesn't think he has to argue for it for whatever reason. He can't seem to, either he's a manipulative sophist who understands that you would have to argue for it, but he can't do it, and therefore he pretends he does it just by throwing whatever around, right? Taking shit for granted, just as he did in the recent, I'm granting this, or I'm just on the same page as materialism, who grants an external world. But it's not a fucking argument, man, right? I think that that's what Philippe is trying to say.
Existence given only essence. Kastrupian analytic idealism is inescapably groundless because it entails building castles in the air.
Or it's just, building castles, but it's this circularity there is in doing metaphysics that I have tried to point it out in this sort of low-level approach to it. Why am I doing metaphysics? Well, it's because I have these experiences. I'm saying that there might be something beyond these experiences. But if I didn't have experiences, it's hard to imagine, right? But let's say I didn't have experiences. Why would I talk about something beyond experiences? Because I don't have the experiences that I'm imagining there's something beyond. So it's because of the experiences I have this fabulation about an external world. So if I want to argue for that external world, it must be based in those experiences. But this is also what Philippe tries to get at. You can't derive an external world from your experiences. It's all imaginary. And I would say also that if you create some external world and start to fabulate about how it works and how it comes back and becomes the lawn, right? The green lawn I'm experiencing. And that deroot through some kind of metaphysics change your understanding of that lawn. You are actually violating the whole system you have created. You are not allowed to change your understanding of that lawn because it was because of the first understanding of that lawn that you started to do this circumventing story of metaphysics. So your metaphysics cannot, in my opinion, be allowed to change your imminent experience or understanding of it. Right? Because it was because you wanted an understanding and a deeper understanding and something before that understanding, lawn or whatever, grass, that you took that circumventing route to get to some kind of metaphysics that you then may change your understanding of that lawn, but you can't be allowed to do that because it was the first understanding that allowed yourself to do that circumventing. So you're creating a circular structure that you're not allowed to. So first of all, if it doesn't change anything, why would I care, right? And if it changed anything, you're actually violating the structure. So it doesn't work in either way. So metaphysics is completely futile, right? But I don't think that Bernardo Kastrup can sleep well at night if he hasn't created some kind of story about what goes on beyond his experiences. And that's why he keeps hanging on to it. It's not because he can argue for it. He just pretends that he can argue for it. But because he can't argue for it, he has to pretend that he argues. He's not willing to say, I am working from the idea. You don't have to. This is my choice. I'm working from this, right? Do your own philosophy. He's not willing to do that. He has to convince you somehow using terms and sophistry and whatever. Bullshit. To convince you that he's actually talking about an external world where there is no falsification possible at all, right? By its nature. By the nature of the idea, right?
But it is also inescapably groundless because the transcendental reality of a mind at large and other minds cannot possibly be sufficiently substantiated a priori or a posteriori. The transcendental reality of a mind at large and other minds cannot possibly be sufficiently substantiated a priori because it is not logically necessary that a mind at large and other minds have transcendental reality, and because it is logically possible that solipsism or egoism is actually the case. Additionally, the transcendental reality of mind at large and other minds cannot possibly be sufficiently substantiated a posteriori because experience affords access only to imminent appearances.
Okay, so this gets a little, it's a dense philosophical speak, this, right? But what I think is being stated here is trying to be skeptical about talking about an external world. And I'm completely on board with that idea. the talk about a priori and a posteriori, it's more like before and after imminent experiences. And you can talk about something before. I have no trust in a priori as such, right? How would you get to something before you have the experience of X, right? And all the other things like emotions and imaginations and abstractions and all that, whatever you want to call it, these are all results of having these imminent experiences. So in my opinion, there is no a priori. But a posteriori is that when you are having these experiences and you are getting to the imaginations and abstractions, but these are then a part of you. They are derivatives of those imminent experiences. So they are not the thing out there, right? So in either case, you are never out there. So if we're talking about an out there, it's pure imagination, right? Basically.
And appearances are representations in me. Further, because it is logically possible.
No, but how do you know they're representations? Then you are indirectly appealing to an external world. Stop that. Why do you say they're representations? Well, you have to establish why you consider them representations. If you have a color, the color is not telling you, I am a representation, right? It's just a color. It's just a sound. It's just a taste. Why is it a representation? How do you get to that? Be careful, dude, right? Don't fall into the same trap as these idiots.
Well, that solipsism is actually the case. It is not logically necessary that representations in me have any necessary connection to any alleged transcendental reality. It is logically possible that solipsism is actually the case, such that it is logically possible that there...
But I would hesitate using the term logical in this particular area. Okay, but let's just... Maybe it's about reasoning rather than logic, right? But yeah, solipsism is a rejection of an external world. There is no external world. There are my experiences, and that's it, right? But that's also going too far, in my opinion, right? Because if I start to wonder about, is there something beyond my experiences, away from my experiences, or before my experiences, or maybe even after my experiences, right? Something extended beyond my experiences, in whatever term you want to use, right? You have to appeal to some term, right? Can I reject that? Well, how would I be able to do it? Because I have to go there in order to check if it's there, right? So I can't say it isn't there either, right? And that's why solipsism doesn't work for me either, right? I can't get to an external world, so I can't say it isn't there, right? But I can't say it is there either because I can't get to it.
There is no transcendental reality at all. Additionally, Mr. Kastrup cannot even in principle appeal to experience at all in attempt to defend his metaphysical idealism. As concerns the sources of metaphysical cognition, its very concept implies that they cannot be empirical. Its principles, including not only its maxims but its basic notions, must never be derived from experience. It must not be physical, but metaphysical knowledge, viz., knowledge lying beyond experience.
Careful again with that knowledge, use of the term knowledge, right? Careful. Because there's a whole set of philosophy called epistemology, which deals with defining what you mean by knowledge. And in the end, I would say knowledge is a reference to a particular aspect of your phenomena. This kind of phenomena, I will classify as knowledge. Something like that, right? Well, if you're talking about an external world, there is no knowledge there, right? And it's also maybe the fluffiness through centuries of confusing philosophy left and right, where people are just throwing around these terms of truth and knowledge and what existence is everywhere. It's just all over the place, right? Nobody has any grasp of it, or very little maybe, or they're not clean enough in their use of the terms. You might be flexible about your use of terms, and it depends on your ontology and how you define the various phenomena in your ontology, how you're using terms. I will let you have that, of course. But if you're doing metaphysics or / ontology, don't use the term knowledge, because there's a very strict set of philosophy called epistemology, as I say, which must come after you have settled your phenomena, right? And that's ontology. And if you want to go back and do that metaphysics of yours, okay, maybe you also need to do that before you venture into epistemology. So don't use the term know or knowledge in dealing with metaphysics.
It can therefore have for its basis neither external experience, which is the source of physics proper, nor internal, which is the basis of empirical psych.
I might add that maybe it's also the reason why Bernardo Kastrup calls it a theory. I'm just coming up with shit about what goes on out there, right? And maybe in the future somebody will figure out it's not correct, right? And maybe he's hoping it's way past his expiry date that it happens, right? But again, why are we doing this? Where are we going with all this? At what point do we get down to business and get down to figuring out whether or not taxation is theft, for instance, right? At what point do we do that? It seems like most philosophers, they want to stay in this imaginary and discuss all these throwing around the terms and semantics and meta-ethics and meta, right? They never get to anything tangible at some end, right? Because if you're never going to get there anyway, why would I care? I don't have the rest of my life to figure this out, right? There are people stealing my shit every month, right? 40% of what I make, somebody's taking. I mean, we've done this kind of philosophy for going on 3,000 years. And we're still trying to figure out if there's an external world or not.
Psychology. It is therefore a priori knowledge, coming from pure understanding and pure reason. Needless to say, Mr. Kastrup's analytic idealism entails apostasis. It involves treating the abstract concept of a mind at large and its alleged alters as if it had concrete transcendental reality, even when neither a mind at large nor its alleged alters can ever be given in concreto in a possible experience. It commits the classical metaphysical error of treating abstract concepts as if they possessed concrete reality. The chief stumbling block of Kastrupian analytic idealism is that it presupposes what it should really explain.
It's a very good observation, and of course I did that observation too, right? But I like that somebody else is also pointing this out, and this is why I have personally my structure of my ontology, which is first the qualia, then the cognitions, and then everything else that follows from that. Following from that, categorized as following from these two steps, A, B, and C, right? So if you're talking about imaginations, which is what he's doing imagination and abstractions or whatever term you're using, right? But they are something that arrived because there were qualia and cognitions, right? If you didn't have any qualia and any cognitions, you wouldn't have any imaginations, right? I suppose. That's an axiom I'm working from, right? Otherwise, well, what the hell are we doing, right? And if I have some imaginations about how my world works before, without having any qualia or cognitions, it would just be some kind of mystic fantasy. It would be some kind of weird, unempirical solipsism of some kind. I don't know, right? But let's get back to that point, which was, yeah, it's because he has a lot of abstractions, a lot of imaginations. These imaginations have become his story. When he has colors and bicycles, these are just sort of everyday boring shit, right? It's the story he has, the reality story he has created, right? And he has created an external part of that internal reality story. And that's why he's talking about an external world, because he can imagine it. And he thinks because he can imagine it, there must be something to it. But these imaginations are also a part of his so-called interior, right? And the idea of this exterior and interior, or external and internal world, it kind of falls apart, that dichotomy, because whatever you can imagine or whatever you can experience is all only just that some phenomena that you have access to. So it's possibly a false dichotomy. You are creating an external world and another realm beyond your realm. And then there's this dichotomy. But there's nothing about that first realm you had access to that enabled you, according to your own standard, to create that other world. That says that there is another world. Right? There's nothing about colors and sounds and taste and bicycles and imaginations and stomach aches that says, oh my God, therefore there must be an external world. All this externality is dogmatic. It's something you have trained yourself, or what's the term? You've gotten used to. I think it's the default setting of a human being to think of your experiences as being external, except maybe for a stomach ache and so on, right? But you would say that your stomach ache is here, not here, right? And then what is there and here? If it's out here and in here and down there, and so down there is, you can't experience if it's not in here, if your mind is here, and we get into this paradox, right? And that creates, among other things, the heart problem and so on, the mind-matter problem. And that's a paradox that I don't think this guy actually jumps very hard on. But it's and I said this a lot of times, right? And I think we are going to stop this when I presented this, right? We are going on the 1 hour mark. But if I say my experiences are in my mind, and my mind is inside my brain, and my brain is inside my skull, and this hand is outside my skull, and I'm saying also I'm experiencing my hand. That's a problem, right? But if my experiences are in here, I can't be experiencing this hand out here. But since I'm experiencing, that hand must be in there. So why am I saying it's out here? Right? That's a paradox you need to deal with, in my opinion. I don't see many people actually digging too deep into that kind of discussion, but it's mandatory in order to avoid all this bullshit. The way Bernardo does it is to say, well, everything is mind, right? So I have solved it. Everything is X. So whenever somebody asks, he's just going to say, well, everything is X. And if people ask, well, what is X? Well, that's what everything is made of. So done, right? Okay, we are at the 5 minute and 18 seconds mark. So there's only 54 minutes left, right? I might not need to go through all 60 minutes here, right? But to get to the point, I have listened through it a couple of times before I do this. So I have an idea that it's possibly a little more long-winded than it needs to be to get this criticism across. So I might not need to do all of it, right? Okay. Have a nice day. See you in the next one.